This is the panel on the corporate role in environmental leadership. We have three excellent speakers today. The order we're going to go in is we'll start out with Professor Michael Lenox of Duke's Fuqua School of Business, and then we will have Linda Fisher from DuPont, and then Jim Rogers. And we're going a little bit abbreviated. Our goal is to end at the latest by 5:15 and preferably at 5 if we can. That's what we're trying to do. Thank you. We'll start out with Professor Lenox. Michael.
I'm used to when being in this room doing case discussions and the like, so I'm going to try to be restrained and not randomly call on somebody and ask them a question, okay? So, but excuse my normal kind of presentation mode here. As you see from the title here, I'm going to be talking about basically a research perspective on this question about business strategy and environmental stewardship. And if we look historically at kind of thoughts about business strategy and environmental stewardship, they've been viewed primarily as a zero-sum game. Environmental regulation or attempts to improve environmental performance from a firm perspective was something that would add to the cost burden of the firm, something that would hurt the bottom line. But what we've seen over the last 10, 20 years in a number of corporations is a recognition that they do actually have private incentives to go, in essence, beyond compliance in some situations. Firms have a number of stakeholders that they have responsive to, consumers who might demand environmentally friendly products. They obviously are impacted by the NGO community. Employees, even shareholders might put substantial pressure on firms that would lead them to go, once again, beyond just what is required by law. As a result of that, we've seen in many ways in a number of corporations, environmental issues move from, in essence, the compliance office and more towards the boardroom. Greater thoughts about strategic thinking around these issues of environmental stewardship. And this is reflected in part by the evolution of environmental management practices we've seen in firms over the last decade or so. We've seen the adoption of sophisticated environmental management systems by firms. We've seen a number of different techniques to incorporate environmental concerns into new product development and the like. We see firms publishing information about their programs and their efforts to be good environmental stewards. And in particular, we've also seen the rise of a number of voluntary initiatives. We've seen in the chemical industry, the American Chemical Council having the Responsible Care Program, an attempt to get industry members to improve their environmental performance. We've seen the rise of environmental management standards that have diffused and proliferated throughout the U.S. and throughout the world, probably most prominently the International Organization of Standardization's 14001 Environmental Management Standard. So it is in that context, and it's given these trends, that really has informed my research over the last 5 to 6 years, looking into these types of issues and these types of behaviors. And in particular, I've been interested in the question of what are the prospects for what I like to refer to as industry self-regulation. What's the prospects that firms will basically provide for the public good beyond that required by law? Very closely related to the question that some people like to call whether it pays to be green. To what extent do firms have these incentives, once again, to go beyond the letter of the law? So my research has asked a series of questions about what are those incentives, how extensive are those incentives, what are the institutional mechanisms, both private and public, that have been established to facilitate self-regulation, and what are also some of the barriers and impediments to self-regulation as well. So for my remaining time here, I'm just going to use this next slide as an outline of some of the different incentives that people have proposed might motivate firms to self-regulate, and just talk a little bit about what some of the academic literature has found in respect to these various incentives that are out there. So one argument that has been advanced increasingly and more recently is the idea that there are those stockholders and investors who are out there who are concerned about the environment, and this might be sufficient to start to motivate firms to change their behavior to be better environmental stewards. Think of social responsibility investing and the like. There are some compelling arguments, though, to suggest that, at least given the current state of affairs, this is unlikely to provide a very strong incentive for firms to change their practices. And the reason is as follows. A lot of these social responsibility investment funds and the like use various screens to weed out firms who are maybe poor environmental performers and the like, often just ruling out certain sectors. But as long as there's a large cadre of other investors who really aren't concerned about these issues, they're willing to provide capital to these firms, and it's unlikely to really even have much of an effect on the stock price of firms and necessarily impact their behavior. How about customers who demand green products? Obviously, there are certain industries, certain areas where we expect to see consumer demand. You think I should know how to work this at this point. All right, here we go. So customers who demand green products. Now, admittedly, this is not an area that I've done research myself, but there is a vast marketing literature who's kind of looked at this question. And in many ways, the findings of this literature are in line with the environmental survey presented earlier today. Customers generally say they're concerned about environment, they'd like to see environmentally friendly products, but at the end of the day, they're unwilling to pay a premium for those environmental products. Now, clearly there's exceptions. There's clearly certain industries and certain segments in which these types of environmental preferences are more salient than others. There's been interesting work that suggests that more luxury items, things like ice cream, think Ben & Jerry's and the like, that people are more willing to consider environmental concerns when making such purchases, as opposed to necessities in those situations. So my reading of that literature is, yes, there are some incentives. They're not necessarily widespread, and they might be somewhat contingent and limited. Another argument that's often advanced is that there are these various stakeholders, many of them represented in this room, NGOs, community groups, and the like, and that these groups can put substantial pressure on firms in a very direct way through things like protests, boycotts, lawsuits, proxy vote initiatives, and the like, and that these might be sufficient to get firms to begin to become better environmental stewards and the like. I've done actually some research looking at various stakeholder group actions. I've looked at over 300 stakeholder-oriented actions against firms over a 30-year period in the United States. And some basic trends we observe. First of all, that these types of actions are increasing. Firm responsiveness to these types of actions are increasing as well. That the degree to which there's more collaborative efforts has been increasing. And in particular, and these are just general trends, we observe kind of two patterns of action by different stakeholder groups. There tends to be large, aggressive stakeholder groups who tend to go after the largest, most visible firms. And often these firms are not necessarily the worst environmental performers within their industry segments. And in many ways, this is a way to attract attention to an issue and to perhaps play a larger game in the larger policy arena to try to influence public policy. There's also smaller, more passive stakeholder groups who tend to target firms who might have a very particular environmental impact that they wish to address and try to change. Perhaps it's an effluent stream in their local community that they would like to see cleaned up or the like. As far as effectiveness, not surprisingly, larger, more aggressive stakeholder groups seem to be more effective. Those who are pursuing more legitimate claims, and by legitimate, I mean simply that the general public agrees about the impacts of those perhaps environmental actions. For example, once again, local community health issues are going to be much more likely to have firms respond to these types of requests made of them than maybe something like global climate change, which is harder to get your hands around. So as with the consumer demand, there are pressures. Stakeholders do put pressure on firms. These pressures do cause firms to think about self-regulation to try to perhaps avoid these types of issues. But once again, it's going to be probably very specific to more larger corporations and the like. And there's probably going to be vast parts of the economy who aren't really affected by these types of actions. A fourth argument often advanced is that firms will self-regulate as a way to basically get out ahead of future government regulation. We're starting to hear some of that out of the energy sector, where firms are concerned about future regulation in terms of global climate change and CO2 emissions. There's a lot of uncertainty about that, and if they can get out ahead of it now, maybe they'll be better positioned in the future when there might be various regulatory instruments that come in the future. This is also an approach which sometimes is viewed as a way to substitute for government regulation, or in some sense, forestall government regulation. And clearly, in some instances, industry has been trying to kind of band together and say, you don't need to regulate us as much, we can regulate ourselves. It's in this context that we've seen the rise of things, once again, like the American Chemistry Council's Responsible Care Program and the like. Once again, it's an area that I've done a number of research projects looking into, and what we've basically found is if you get the structures right, these types of voluntary initiatives can actually be quite effective. But you have to get the structures right. And by structures in this case, mainly, do you have monitoring and sanctioning mechanisms in place to ensure that firms who are signing on to these initiatives are actually complying with the standards being set out and set forth in these initiatives? Absent those, in economist terms, we observe adverse selection and moral hazard. Basically, dirtier firms seem to seek these initiatives, and they tend to do less than they would otherwise do in the absence of these initiatives. These initiatives also suffer from a problem of free riding. To the extent that a number of these are a way to demonstrate to the general public as an attempt to, once again, kind of substitute or forestall government regulation, there's an incentive for individual firms to free ride off the efforts of others, to allow other firms to kind of reduce and improve their environmental performance at the same time that they don't really have to do anything. One solution that firms have tried to come up with for this problem is to use these initiatives as a way to differentiate themselves. Use this as a way to say, we're good environmental stewards and perhaps get these consumer demands and these stakeholder benefits that I've talked about earlier. Unfortunately, in a number of these cases, it doesn't seem to necessarily serve that type of purpose. And just to give you an example, I have some research coming out looking at ISO 14000, at least in the United States. And it does seem, for example, that ISO 14000 leads to the adoption of environmental management standards. And in fact, the existence of an environmental management system does lead to some improvements. But what's interesting is that those firms who are most attracted to and seek out these types of certification schemes tend to be older, dirtier types of facilities and the like. And it kind of makes sense if you want to have a management program in place if you have the greatest liabilities associated with your operations. So once again, these types of collective action, voluntary initiatives have some promise, but they have to be structured correctly, and you have to be careful about what they are actually delivering at the end of the day. Finally, there's a very intriguing hypothesis or idea out there that there are these innovation offsets that come from when you turn your attention to environmental problems. Numerous anecdotes out there of firms who, when they started thinking about their environmental waste, their environmental impacts, they discovered innovations, solutions that not only solved those environmental problems, but actually had efficiency benefits as well. And I've done some work in this arena as well, looking at the population of US manufacturing firms over a 15-year period. And we actually find some evidence, some compelling evidence that, in what term typically used, pollution prevention, that pollution prevention pays. That by turning your attention once again to the generation of waste, that there is often an efficiency benefit associated with it. With that said, you would expect, and we find, that there are decreasing returns to those types of activities as well. So it's a question of how far will firms go down this route? How far can they go and still recognize and receive these types of innovation offsets from these types of endeavors? I should say, though, there is kind of a broader hope that more broad-scale product innovation might have these types of offsets as well. And we might be seeing that in, like, for example, the auto industry, where Toyota and others developing hybrid technology not only has an environmental benefit, but it actually provides some benefit and delivers value in new ways that customers are demanding these cars, not for necessarily environmental reasons, but because of these performance advantages these types of systems provide. So there is some promise there of these potential innovation offsets. All right, so as far as my conclusions, to those who sit here and think firms will never do anything beyond the letter of the law, I'd say, well, wait a second. There are certain conditions in which we can expect firms to have private incentives to go beyond compliance, to self-regulate in my terminology, to provide environmental stewardship. But of course, to those who might think that firms are going to solve the world's problems, let's not go so far. There are constraints on this, there are limitations, and the thought that firms would independently solve these problems is definitely perhaps going too far. I think more interestingly, we identify some barriers to even when incentives are in place. Perhaps consumers would care about the environment, but they have no way of getting information to separate out who's a good environmental steward and who's not. And this is where both private and public institutions can play a role to facilitating self-regulatory behavior. I also think it's important to point out from a societal perspective that this also suggests various public policy mechanisms that we typically don't talk about. I think the debate, especially in the United States, still comes down often to whether to regulate or not. And when we think about regulate, we think about command and control or perhaps a trade and permit system. But there are other possibilities. Information disclosure, forcing firms to reveal information about their practices to allow then customers and other stakeholders to internalize those externalities, if you will. R&D policy. To what extent does federal R&D policy support the development of innovative technologies and help them diffuse to firms that might solve both environmental problems and efficiency problems within firms? And we've seen some of that with the EPA, like their Energy Star program and the like over time. So just leave you once again that I think the research has kind of revealed that there are private incentives, but they don't necessarily go all the way. And we need to think through kind of those conditions under which those private incentives exist when we're designing both public policies and thinking about these private mechanisms as well. Thank you very much.
Very good, Michael. Our plan is to have each of the speakers speak for 12 to 15 minutes, and then we will come for Q&A. Our next speaker is Linda Fisher, the former Deputy Administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency and is now the VP for Sustainability at DuPont. Linda?
Thank you. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I want to talk to you about DuPont's approach to sustainable growth, the trajectory that we have been on probably for the past 20 or 30 years, and why we're doing some of the things we do, very complementary to what you just heard. First of all, a little bit about DuPont's journey towards sustainable growth. If you look at this chart, it kind of plots business value with the integration of sustainability concepts into our business model. You can also, on the bottom, perhaps plot the timeline of the growth of environmental laws and regulations, starting maybe in the 70s, all the way out to 2005 and beyond. For years, companies like DuPont, with the advent of environmental laws and regulations, were focused on compliance. Environmental regulations were looked at as a cost of doing business and as something companies had to do to have the freedom to operate, but not something they really wanted to do. Somewhere towards the late 80s, companies like DuPont started to get a different attitude around the environment, and they began to incorporate environmentalism into their philosophies, into their values. It's that time when you saw companies engaging in voluntary programs, emission reduction programs. DuPont itself at the time set a goal of reducing things like its air toxics emissions by 90%, very aggressive, its waste by 75%. So there really was an understanding pollution prevention pays. There was a lot of research, a lot of money spent into looking at how can we do our business better, how can we become a better corporate steward. But it was still very much looking at what are the regulations going to impose on us and how can we get out ahead of that. In the beginning, say, around 1990, companies began to get more aggressive. The issue of climate change was on the horizon. Questions around energy started to become, I think, much more prevalent in the environmental debate. And again, DuPont started to look at, again, its own footprint and what else it could do beyond the commitments it had already made. And it was in the 90s that we began to look at climate change. We made a pledge to reduce our greenhouse gases by 70% by the year 2010. We made a pledge to keep our energy flat to 1990 levels, which we have succeeded in doing. And so this idea of going beyond just our footprint reduction and looking at issues of renewable resources, at energy, kind of beyond just our plant environmental footprint was the path that we were on. But we were still looking at the environment, I would say, from a environment, safety, and health point of view. Environmental policy came from one part of the company. We hadn't totally integrated it into our business model. And then a couple years ago, our CEO, Chad Holliday, adopted a new vision for the company. And its vision was to take our science, which we are very good at, and look at how we can create sustainable solutions that would improve society, and not just society that we were comfortable or used to selling into, but looking at societies everywhere, even at the bottom of the pyramid. So we really started to take on the challenge of sustainable development and sustainable growth. We are not there yet. It is still a vision. We have not achieved it. But I want to talk to you about some of the forces that led DuPont to get on this path and to create this vision. So the question, I think, is sustainability. Why now? For a multinational chemical company, the rules of the road are very different today than they were even 10 or 15 years ago. Civil society and the role of government are changing very, very fast. Governance is shifting. It used to be DuPont worried a lot about what the federal government was telling it to do. Today we worry not just about what the federal government's telling us to do, but we're very aware of global governments and local governments. We're talking in the earlier panels about the state actions on climate change, very important to us. State toxic laws, very important to us. The REACH program in Europe, which is a regulatory program for chemicals, very important to us. We no longer look at just the federal government. Society is also becoming much more concerned about the products we make, not just the imprint of our facility on the environment. Used to be a company's reputation could be made by operating its facilities really well. Today, society is asking much deeper questions about what are the products you're bringing to market? Do they have a societal value? And how are you really viewing your role in addressing some of the poverty we see in the country? Another change that has hit us profoundly is the access to information. The internet has totally changed how the public engages companies and how the public engages government. And it has taken, in a way, the traditional role of government in telling society what is safe and what is not safe, and society is itself making decisions. Anybody can go on the internet and find out all sorts of good, bad things about DuPont and DuPont's products, and they affect us immediately as a company, and they affect our markets immediately. One of the presenters earlier was talking about the fact that we now can detect chemicals in people's blood. And the point was made, you can't necessarily rush out and regulate everything that you find in blood. You really need to first figure out, does that substance cause a risk? Well, in the marketplace, if people decide they don't want to buy a product because they are afraid it's going to end up in their blood, the regulator is no longer part of that decision. It is society making a decision about a product based upon what they have read. So in a sense, society has become our regulator, not just government. And it's all because of this access to information. Society is viewing risk differently than it used to. We had some presenters this morning that, from the faith-based community. There are a lot of different definitions of risk, definitions of corporate social responsibility and what is acceptable that are very different from what was expected of a company like DuPont before. And we have to be responsive to that. It used to be, again, government decided what was acceptable or not acceptable. Now society is making those decisions. And society's view of risk is different depending on where you operate in the world. And it can have a very strong social or values component. Because of that, science itself is not the only path to a freedom to operate. You need to know the science around your products. You need to be sure your products are safe. But people are no longer asking just science-based questions. They're asking a lot of social policy questions of companies. The public's understanding and acceptance of risk is heavily influenced by the NGO community and by the media. And that's something corporations have to pay attention to. And the rules of engagement have changed. It used to be people just sued corporations or the government if they didn't like what people were doing. Today, they boycott your products. And lastly, I think the issues are really moving ahead of government's ability to address them. Environmental issues and sustainability issues are moving ahead of a regulatory body's ability to deal with them. It will be years before EPA will be able to speak with authority to the public about whether or not the chemicals in their blood are causing them harm or not. The public may not want to wait for that regulatory decision. So companies have to start making decisions around how they're going to operate in this new environment. So all of this means that marketplace dynamics are really changing. The point of influence for the NGO community is growingly in the marketplace, not in the government, not in the courts, although those are still active places for them to operate in, but really in the marketplace. The NGO community knows, as Mike said earlier, if you go after a big company with a big reputation, they will respond. It makes it very difficult if you're a big company with a big reputation because your competitor might be a little company with no reputation and you're held to different standards and those standards can be expensive. The NGOs know that the media and the internet can be very effective. They are cheap, they are fast, and they are global. And they also know, again, that a market leader, if you can get a market leader to change their behavior, you actually might be able to bring along the industry. Not always, but you might be able to do that. The good news is there are frequently, for companies that have strong research programs and are fleet of foot, you can actually create a lot of market opportunities around sustainable issues, but you can also lose a lot of markets as well. Some examples of marketplace campaigns that have targeted our customers but have definitely affected how we look at issues. Greenpeace has targeted a series of chemicals that are used in the electronics industry. DuPont sells into the electronics industry, and so for us to be successful, we need to be looking at what are the substitutes that we can sell into that industry to meet the demands that Greenpeace is placing on them. This is another electronics industry that's been subject to the same campaign. Samsung decided to take some steps to address Greenpeace's concern. Hewlett-Packard did not, which is why they have the red. Ford has been targeted by Rainforest Action Network, and they changed. They accelerated bringing their hybrids to market. Again, a big customer of ours, so it's important for us to know what are the pressures put on Ford so that we can help, as a materials manufacturer, them meet some of the sustainability pressures that are put on them. So why sustainable growth? Well, it saves lives. DuPont's original commitment to sustainability grows out of its commitment to safety. DuPont began 200 years ago as an explosives manufacturer, and it learned very quickly that safety was the most important core value it could have. It avoids pain. Any CEO whose company has been the target of a market-based campaign knows how painful it can be. Any CEO who has had class action suits brought because of its products, frivolous as they may be, knows how painful those can be. The shareholder actions at the annual meeting and going into those annual meetings are painful. Sustainable growth does protect the environment. We know that, and we live in the environment. Our workers and our families operate in the environment, in the communities that we operate in. Sustainable growth enhances our reputation. It can enhance our brand. Sometimes I think a company's commitment to sustainable growth, to the environment, to corporate stewardship are truly things that can distinguish it from other companies. Absolutely, it increases employee morale. We have found considerable employee interest, both when we get positive press on the things we have done, as well as when we get attacked. We know from our own benchmarking that a strong commitment to sustainable growth, to environmental protection, has improved our productivity. It has definitely lowered costs. Our commitment to our public pledge to keep our energy at our 1990 levels has saved the company $2 billion. That was when oil was $30 a barrel. We did those calculations. And at the same time, we've grown the company 30%. So we know that it lowers costs. To the extent we really understand the pressures put on our customers, we really can improve our customer relationships. And we can use our science to develop products that they're going to need, again, to meet the demands put on them in the future. And so sustainable growth, to the extent we understand and can define and can design into those markets, really can help grow our business. So in closing, there is a business case for sustainable growth, but there are challenges that perhaps the Nicholas Center can help us with. The first is how to really educate the business leaders to be successful and see this as an integrated part of your business strategy. It's got to be understood by more than just the people that have environmental backgrounds and come out of the Environment, Safety, and Health Division. We really need to understand better the NGO community and how to engage with them. And we need to have some good metrics around what are sustainable products. How do you decide a product is really better for the environment than another one? How do we succeed in making our customers more sustainable? And it doesn't really mean we need to get rid of or eliminate regulation. In fact, frequently government policies and government regulations can actually help level the playing field and create the market opportunities for the more sustainable products. And lastly, one of the challenges we have is we really are in a global marketplace. And as China and India develop their capacity to produce materials and to produce chemicals, it's going to be important that they are held to the same environmental standards that DuPont is, because they really are going to be our competition. I was interested earlier today, somebody talked about how big companies are moving overseas to avoid regulation. Here, I actually look at it differently. DuPont is meeting environmental standards at its plants in China and India. We are holding ourselves largely to the same standards that we have in the United States. Our problem is really that the state-owned companies in China don't have to meet those standards, and their products and their facilities aren't being held to the same standards than ours are. So I would suggest it's not really that we're moving there to avoid those standards. In fact, there's huge business growth opportunity over there. What we need to do is help make this debate around sustainable growth in the environment a global discussion so that we can really raise the bar for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Our final speaker is Jim Rogers, the CEO of Synergy Corporation, merging with Duke Energies. Jim?
Yeah. I have a very tough assignment. First, I have to follow both Michael and Linda. I also have to follow them without any slides. First, we're a low-cost company. And when you provide energy services, being low cost is really critical. The second thing, I think it's only appropriate that a CEO of an energy company would be the last speaker of the day. And the reason I think it's appropriate, because in our business, the buck really does stop with me. And talking about environmental issues, I think it's very important for me to take a moment and frame how we think about it, how our board thinks about it, and how I believe the combination of Synergy and Duke will think about it. First of all, we're a huge consumer of fossil fuels. When you combine the two companies, we'll burn 50 million tons of coal a year. The third largest consumer of coal, Synergy on a standalone basis, is the fifth largest consumer of coal in the United States. And quite frankly, because to provide electricity and natural gas to heat people's homes, to keep these lights on, to keep your computer running, to keep your television operating, we burn those fuels in order to deliver that product, but we're under continuous pressure to make sure we do it at a low cost, and also do it in an environmentally responsible way. And so when I phrase the questions for you, and try to give you a sense of the debate in the boardroom, I want you to understand what is our true north. Our true north is really about balancing the oftentimes competing demands of the various stakeholders that we have within our organization. Think about them. Investors, you know what they demand, and you know the demands quarterly and annually. We also have the demands of our customers, who want reliable energy, but they want it at the lowest reasonable price. We have our employees who have demands in terms of job security, as well as maintaining an environment where they have great career opportunities and a chance to grow and develop and find joy in what they do every day. We have it with respect to the communities we serve. It's critical to our success that the communities that we operate in are healthy communities, growing communities. It's critical for us, and one of our key stakeholders is the environment. I think as an energy company, we have a special responsibility to deal with environmental issues in a proactive way, to lead on these issues, to lead policymakers on these issues, to embrace the issues that are in our future, to bring people together, and that's one of the things y'all are doing here, and I applaud y'all for that, because I believe that all knowledge starts with a conversation. And what I hope is going on here today, and I believe is going on today, a lot of good conversations between people with different ideas, different points of view, and it's in that kind of conversation that people get greater insight. Now, you might not be able to get your friends outside their comfort zone, but good conversation often leads to people expanding their comfort zones. And that's how you find public policy outcomes. And that's why I appreciate being included today, because I think what you're doing is very important to the future of our country. But within the boardroom, we think of these issues in terms of how do we balance the interest of the various stakeholders. Let me tell you a little bit about one company's journey to kind of put in perspective how to think about these issues. First of all, we emit a significant amount of SOx, NOx, and CO2. We emit maybe 62 million tons a year of CO2. And we think it's very important to deal with this issue of global warming. Anybody that goes to our website will see our annual report last year, which was entitled, "Can We Find Common Ground on Global Warming?" The reason we made that the centerpiece of our annual report is because we think that's a critical issue in our future. And whether our government deals with it today or tomorrow, we think we have a responsibility to deal with it now. And because the solution is not a one-year solution, it's not a decade, it's multiple decades before we can resolve this issue. So the sooner we go to work on it, the better we are. Policymakers will catch up. So in our approach, what we've done is we've made a commitment to reduce our emissions roughly 5%. We can do that in a way that doesn't drive cost up for our consumers. That's a good thing. But as Fred said a few moments ago, there are no silver bullets. So what we're looking at is we know we're going to have to build more power plants in the future. We know we're going to have to use coal. I was delighted to hear several people on the final panel say, kind of left me with the impression that coal is not a four-letter word. And when you burn as much coal as we do, you kind of know people are not very happy about that. But over 50% of the electricity in this country comes from coal. It's a viable alternative. We're going to have to learn to use it in a more environmentally benign way, and we will. But one of the things we're going to do is spend $1 billion to build a coal gasification plant. Old technology, evolving. We're going to look at carbon sequestration because that is one of the keys for our country going forward. So invest in technology. And by the way, I mean, I don't know if you've paid attention, there hasn't been much coverage in this country, but our country entered into a joint agreement with China, India, South Korea, and Japan to have a joint technology development to be able to generate energy in a way that reduces CO2. Because part of the answer is a technology that works, that we can retrofit. We don't have that technology today on the back end of our plants. So investing in technology, setting voluntary standards to reduce. Because we've already spent significant money reducing SOx and NOx. I look back over the last decade and a half, and we've reduced our SO2 maybe 50%, our NOx 45%. We're getting ready to spend $1.8 billion in the next 5 years. It's going to reduce another 70% off our current levels. Rather dramatic reduction in SOx and NOx. CO2 is the next frontier for us. The other thing we're looking at is improving the efficiency of our existing plants. Some of the environmental regulations are an impediment to improving efficiency. If we could just improve the efficiency of our units, our large units, 1%, we would reduce our emissions of carbon 400,000 tons a year. 1%. And we have the technology to do it. We need to find ways to use those technologies and have rules that really allow us to do that. Just one of the answers, not a complete answer. So from our standpoint, embracing all these different approaches is really critical to dealing with the carbon issue. It's just one example. But as you look forward, there are cost implications. One of our responsibilities is to educate consumers. Educating policymakers is important, but we all know people that vote are the ones that really have an impact on what politicians do. And if they need to understand. And so one of the things we're getting ready to do is offer a new product to our customers. And the new product is carbon-free electricity. It'll be interesting to see how many people will sign up for that. How many people will pay a premium for carbon-free electricity? It's kind of like Diet Coke. Or Classic, or which one is it? I don't want to get confused on the branding. But the point of the matter is, it's those kind of things that help develop the debate. Because you need to test people. You can do surveys all day long, and we have with our customers, and ask them, well, where's environmental relative for you? And they all go, top issue. Would you pay 15% more for electricity? Bottom of the list issue. So people need to get educated as to what the cost implications of doing this are at every level, not just policymakers. So I started my career as a consumer advocate, fighting rate increases at utility companies. And in the process of making the evolution that I've made, I realized how important it is to balance the demands of these stakeholders. And part of the reasons I've been around, almost my 17th anniversary as CEO is next month, the reason I've been around so long is because I've worked consistently to balance the interest. But now let me kind of mention one other thing. This is not vodka, but it would help. I have a little allergy problem, and I either have a choice between drinking, breathing, or talking. But let me kind of leave you with one message. We need to be thoughtful about these issues. We need to engage the policymakers in this country with respect to these issues. We need to do robust analysis to understand the cost implications and what we're going to try to achieve. We need to build consensus on these issues. Environmental issues are neither Republican or Democrat. They're American issues, and we need to realize that. And we need to be open in terms of solutions. We need to expand our comfort zones as we deal with these issues. We need to listen. I mean, at the end of the day, the most valuable thing we can do is have the capability to listen. And when corporations listen, they get it right because they understand what people are saying, and they are focused on the issues that are important to the people that they serve, whether it's their customers, whether it's the investors. But as I think about these issues, I would leave you with another test that's important. And I call it the grandchildren's test. When I make decisions, I think about the quarterly impact on our earnings. I think about the annual impact. I think about what impact it'll have on our balance sheet. But the test that I apply is a grandchildren's test. And what that means to me is this. When my grandchildren, many, many decades from now, look back at the decision that I've made as a CEO of the company and look back at the decisions of the corporation, they go, those are still good decisions. And that's how we ought to measure success in life. Success in life is really about, are we making good decisions today about the future? And it's not the future of tomorrow, it's a future that's 5 decades away. Because I really want my grandchildren to say, my granddad did a great job. He dealt with carbon, unafraid to do it. He understood the importance of balancing the interest of all stakeholders. He paid attention to other environmental issues. He worried about the cost impact on consumers and didn't let those costs get too high. And he figured out a way to smooth out the trajectory. I mean, the worst thing I worry about in terms of the environmental issues, and particularly climate, is that we put our head in the sand, we don't deal with it, we wake up 10 years from now or 15 years from now and say, oh my God. And then all of a sudden the cost impacts are huge, there's dislocation in our economy. We're much smarter to go to work today, to slow the emissions, to let them peak and then reverse them, but to go to work today because there is no substitute for smoothing out the impact on our economy and the impact on the people of this country and around the world. And the only way we can really do that is going to work today. I think going to work today passes the grandchildren's test. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Before I go to Q&A and some comments from the panelists, I'd like to make a couple of remarks myself. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Doug Breeden, the Dean of the Fuqua School of Business here. And the first thing I want to do is say a big thanks to Pete and Jenny Nicholas for getting the Nicholas Institute going, and their sons J.K. and Peter's wife Christy. The Nicholas family are one of the most wonderful families for Duke University, and I talk to our students about making a positive world impact with their lives, and you're doing that in spades. So thank you so much for all you do. If I might make a couple of comments more, I'd say, you know, one of the things that, as I think about business and the environment that I see is we bring in a lot of distinguished speakers here to the Fuqua School, business leaders, government leaders, and nonprofit leaders. We just had in the head of Chiquita Brands, I think, a week or two ago, and we just had in the head of UPS yesterday speaking to our students, and they're talking about their companies and their role in leadership. And one of the things that is intriguing to me, that is a common thread because they're all so different, is many of them will speak about the power of a corporate culture. And that if you have a great corporate culture, lots of really good things happen. And I think that echoes well. Also a common thing, I mean, businesses are just driven bananas by the legal system, okay? So I have to say that when Linda talked about that, I had to kind of nod my head as well, saying I really think that the legal system is not the best way for lots of things. Now, it is for some things. There certainly have to be some bounds in the legal system and liabilities. But I think we'll make much greater progress by actually talking to people as if they are, most of the people in business, are good people, intending to do good things, and that we all want to work. I see our students coming out of here, top-class MBAs. They want to work for companies that they believe are doing good things and behaving responsibly. And I think both Linda and Jim talked about things related to that. They want a company that takes care of the environment, that passes the grandchildren's tests that Jim's talking about there. I think there also is a correlation of companies that pass this kind of test with other values of ethics and probably the integrity of financial statements and lots of other things as well. So I don't know that the costs are that high of behaving well, in the sense that behaving well, it does bring on a lot of other good things that help pay for it, as well as being the right thing to do. So let me stop with those remarks and invite your questions. First, let me ask Linda, do you have any follow-up remarks that you would like to make? Or Michael, Jim had the last word. Okay, so let's open it up for a Q&A. Yes, please.
What I'd like to know is, you all talked about U.S.-based companies, I'm assuming. To what extent do you think the U.S.-based companies, how do they differ from European companies? You mentioned about China and India, so that's one set of companies. But I'm thinking about European companies. Do they meet the grandchildren's test, for example? Are they more green? I mean, in terms of what Linda's talking about, do they feel that they have moved more towards the sustainability? My son, for example, works for a Dutch bank, and I think they're far more green than American banks today. I see the same thing with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Have a lot more European companies working and trying to bring about change. So I just wanted to see how it contrasts to the extent that you know about European companies. How do you stack this up against them?
Okay, so I presume most people heard that, but just to repeat briefly, how are U.S.-based companies different from European companies in their handling of the environment? Linda, do you have a comment on that?
I can only give impressions. I don't have any data. The environmental community, the environmental pressures in Europe are very strong. So I think that probably many European companies are aggressively pursuing agendas of sustainability, sustainable growth, however you want to define it. It's hard for me to make broad generalizations as to kind of who's better. But I think my sense is they are, first of all, the big ones are global, so they're dealing with pressures in the U.S. pressures in Europe the same as DuPont is. We have a lot of facilities in Europe. And so my sense is that some companies may be ahead, some companies may be behind, and in some areas they may be ahead. In other words, some European companies may be ahead of us in addressing issues around greenhouse gases, because it's maybe been a bigger issue, although I don't know of any that have actually done more than DuPont has. The U.S. may have done more on other air pollutants just because of our regulatory basis. I think the global companies generally probably have a pretty strong environmental ethic. But again, the pressures in Europe are significant, so it doesn't surprise me that your son's experience is pretty positive.
Jim, any comments on that one?
I think historically, European countries focus more on a stakeholder approach, and in part because of just the type of governments they have and the emphasis that they had. In the U.S., I think the historical view is that companies were really focused on profit and earnings, and everything else was interesting, but you know, the bottom line is let's deliver on our targets. I think that's changed. I think you see a significant change in the United States in terms of focus on sustainability, on stewardship. I think you see that clearly in all the multinational companies. But also in the more regionally located companies, you see that emphasis. So I think there's been an evolution in this country. I've been going to the World Economic Forum in Davos for years, and I listen to the sustainability, how they talk about it and all. They talk about it differently than we do, but I'm not sure at the end of the day the actions are substantially different.
Michael, do you have anything to add?
It's not about area domain, but at least the stereotypes also are differences in the interface between regulation and corporations as well, where the U.S. has devised a much more adversarial process than they have in Europe, which is a much more collaborative process. So you can imagine that might affect attitudes as well.
Next question. First row at the top or second row at the top? Yes.
Actually, I have a question for you because I'd like to follow up on the final point made by Rogers there about increasing sensitivity to sustainability companies. And it made me wonder, how does that carry over to the premier business school in terms of how they teach their students? Is there more emphasis now on such training and sensitizing your students when they go out in the world to be thinking of more than just the bottom line? How does that affect your students?
Well, we certainly have some courses that do discuss these issues, but I think it's so pervasive now that, to be honest, our students, I think, get more of this in their day-to-day lives and challenges and just in their living than they do directly in a business school. So it comes in with the students a bit like air these days. It's not a really separate issue. It's just part of living. And our students are really focused on living lives that are good lives. And they want to be financially successful, but they know that that's not all there is to it. And they want to go for the goal. They want to be financially successful and live and work for a company that they think behaves well and responsibly. Next question right above that. Yes.
Well, the good news is that CEO of Duke and I are in complete agreement that we'll live in a carbon-constrained world in the future. I think the only difference is what is our preference in terms of taxes versus cap and trade. Paul really believes taxes is a way to kind of get people focused and make it across the economy rather than just picking on the utility industry to reduce their emissions, which only represent maybe 40% of the total emissions in this country. and to really get people focused that there are others. I mean, there's cars, that there's other sources of carbon. I think the way you reconcile those two different opinions is I spent 10 years in Washington, and I'm a pragmatist. I don't think you ever get a carbon tax passed as a practical point. But the lessons associated with carbon tax, all economists would tell you carbon tax is the right answer. But my judgment is the right political answer in terms of getting progress today is really about cap and trade. We had such a great experience with SO2 and being able to do that at a lower cost to reduce SO2 lower than we would have otherwise because of the cap and trade system. So as a practical point, I think that both Duke and Synergy are at the same place. And quite frankly, if you look at the Bingham proposal, which I believe will be a tipping point in terms of regulatory action or legislative action in this country, the Bingham proposal was a cap and trade that morphed into a tax if the cap and trade mechanisms didn't work. So in a sense, it's a hybrid that marries the two concepts together. So I believe that they're very compatible points of view. In terms of, yeah, we were required to do it, but we did it in a way, and we have a proposal now pending before one of our state commissions in the Midwest where we're proposing to actually clean up sooner than under the CARE rule because we believe it's consistent with multi-emission legislation that had been introduced in Congress but never passed that allowed us to clean up sooner and smooth it out and smooth out the impact on consumers. So again, I think you have to always be balancing what's the consumer impact and sometimes, and clearly in that case, spending money now and doing reductions consistent with what we believe the right timetable is, which is sooner than the CARE rule, we believe smooths out the impact and reduces the cost on consumers. So that would be an example of where we're complying out of step with the EPA, in advance of, I might add, but in a way that reduces and smooths out the impact on consumers over time.
Yes, please.
This question is really for Linda, but I think Jim might be able to address it as well. You talked about the issues of our major companies focusing on sustainability and good environmental stewardship, and that they maintain those values when they go to developing countries. And the problem that you face with some of the developing country industries not following the same practices. So what are the approaches that can be used to help educate them and improve the situation so that, in fact, you can continue to operate profitably in, say, other places and we don't increase the pollution load on the planet because pollution now is global and not local?
Linda?
Well, we haven't solved that problem yet, Linda. But some of the things we do is we try to work with the regulators in those countries to understand why some of the technologies we're bringing in are the right technologies. We'll try to work with the communities and engage. But frequently, some of the tools we use in the U.S. are not common, particularly in developing nations. They may not have a very strong regulatory agency. They may not have the resources to have one. They may not be used to community engagement in the same way that companies in the United States have learned to do that. But I think those are still valuable tools. It really is one of education and then trying to help people grow their own local expertise, technical expertise. Because at the end of the day, for a US-based company to go into a developing nation and say, trust us, doesn't work a whole lot better than for us to say, trust us in America. You really do need somebody else that the communities can turn to. So we try to work with the regulatory agencies. We try to get their technical expertise up. And find, in the US, same as in the US, that transparency frequently helps a lot.
Go for one last question here. Yes.
Stimulating some focus on stewardship and long-term view, if that would
both, if the United States could break away from focus on quarterly earnings or annual earnings.
Michael, you want to comment on that, or who wants to tackle that? Sure.
Well, clearly firms have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, and they're responsive to that. I think you're raising a question of whether they're being myopic, right? Are investors themselves not thinking of the long-term consequences of the actions from an even direct financial standpoint? And I don't know if anyone has the answer to that. Economists tend to like to believe that investors are pretty smart. And even if they are looking at today's figures, they are thinking about the long-term impacts of those. So the perhaps academic answer would be, it seems unlikely that somehow changing that perspective would actually change the investor behavior that much. Practically, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe there would be some acceptance of investments that have maybe a longer payoff if you did change that focus. Jim, do you have a comment on this one?
You do the trade-off in every decision you make. I mean, I wouldn't be tricked into thinking there's sort of you're out there making quarterly earnings and your annual targets, that's your primary driver, hell or high water. Because we're in a capital-intensive business where we're making 30-year decisions when we build a power plant. And so we're making kind of long-term decisions every day. But we're also doing them in the context of knowing that we're competing for capital. We still have to give good returns. We're competing with other firms, other industries to get capital investment in our business. So I think that trade-off is made virtually every quarter, every year, as you look at your capital program and your O&M.
Linda, a final word?
I agree absolutely with what Jim Rogers just said. I also think people who care about these issues, people who believe, as I do, that there is a market case for sustainable growth for these new technologies, I think there's a role for us to play in translating that to Wall Street. Why it does make sense for DuPont to invest in renewable resources, to try to find technologies that are going to use biofuels and biomass to produce energy and chemicals in the future. And that those aren't just kind of out there feel-good investments. They really are the next generation of products and technologies that the globe will want and that the market will pay for. And so I think one of the things we need to do, and again, the school can be helpful, is figure out what the metrics are and help get Wall Street's mind around why some of those investments really are important to the long-term growth of individual companies.
I was just thinking that given the great deed that they have done, I wonder if the Nicholas family, Pete, Jenny, J.K., Peter, Christy, anyone want to ask a question or make a comment? My goodness, if I had given $70 million, if I had a question, I'd make them answer it. Pete, any comments or questions? Let's talk privately. Okay. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.